Hello, welcome back to Histopast Forward. Tonight, we'll take a long walk together through the silent corridors of the past. But before we begin, I have a small request for you. If there's anything you'd like me to improve in this video, whether it's the pace of my narration, my tone of voice, or the structure of the content, please share it with me in the comments. Every piece of feedback helps me make these journeys even more peaceful and meaningful for you. Tonight's story is titled The Shocking Truth of Mesopotamia's Advanced Civilization. Sometimes the deepest traces are hidden in history's most silent moments. In this series, we will touch upon real stories ranging from the daily life of Mesopotamia to the shadows of its temples, from its markets to its star observations, each one interconnected, each woven with the small yet impressive strategies humans developed to survive. Now, I'm going to ask you for something very special. Can you write in the comments where you live and what time it is right now? Connecting with listeners from all over the world makes the night even more meaningful for me. And now the time has come. Please dim the lights, pull your blanket over you, take a deep breath, and close your eyes. Because now, our story begins. As you close your eyes in the silence of the night, we slowly journey towards the soft, warm earth of Mesopotamia, to the lands where history, words, order, and also silence began. This fertile region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was, like many firsts, the birthplace of the first written laws. But the pain of this birth was more ordinary than you might imagine. There were no great wars, no epic moments of decision. Everything began with water overflowing from a simple field, a debt unpaid on time, or a lost sheep. Thousands of years ago, as the first rays of daylight were still seeping the rough mounds of mud, there were scribes waking up at the edges of cities. Their hands were mixed with clay. With small reed pens, they left marks on clay tablets. These marks were the first examples of what we now call cuneiform, but at that time no one called them laws or legal codes. They were just records of an event, perhaps the amount of a debt, perhaps the details of a transaction. But every word written was a reflection of the desire to resolve a small chaos within society. Life in that era was very simple, yet equally fragile. People tilled their fields, grazed their animals, and sent goods to distant markets with caravans. But things didn't always go smoothly. Sometimes a peasant's irrigation water would overflow into his neighbor's field. Sometimes a merchant wouldn't pay for goods received, and sometimes an animal would go missing or be stolen. Such situations would create minor disputes between people, but these disagreements sometimes escalated into intertribal conflicts. It was at this very point that the leading figures of society felt the need to find a solution. Initially, these solutions were oral. Each event would be narrated before tribal elders or priests, then serving as a precedent for similar situations. Over time, decisions made for similar events began to accumulate. Memory could no longer carry everything, so some began to write these decisions on clay. The purpose was to remember what course of action to follow when the same thing happened again in the future. Therefore, the first writings were not actually laws, but rather examples written to support a kind of collective memory. For instance, one tablet read, "If a man tears down the wall of another man, he shall give him 3 silver shekels." This was not a rule, but the outcome of a past event. Yet this outcome formed a basis for similar situations. Another tablet stated, "If a slave escapes from his master's house and someone hides him, the person who hides him shall be flogged." Again, it was the outcome of an event, However, these outcomes gradually began to form the foundation of society. As these records increased over time, the tablets stored in the walls of temples and palaces began to pile up. Scribes became not just recorders but also interpreters. Some scribes started writing more detailed narratives. Who did what, when, where, and how? What was the outcome? As these details came together, the behavioral map of society gradually took shape. Temples, in those days, were not merely places of worship, they were also archives, and these archives housed the most important records of society: land agreements, debt notes, marriage contracts. All were kept in rooms located in the shadows of these sacred places. Temple priests oversaw these documents, interpreted them when necessary, and even had them rewritten. This meant there was a subtle but effective link between divinity and governance. Where writing was born, the foundations of order were also quietly laid. But not everything ended in the temples. With the growth of cities, trade also began to increase. A caravan starting from would extend to Sippar, then to Larsa, and finally to Babylon. This intercity trade brought with it different customs, cultural norms, and, naturally, different understandings of right. A behavior accepted in one city could cause problems in another. This created a need for a more comprehensive and universal order, and at this very point it was no longer possible to be content with mere examples. Rail memory was insufficient, and records were scattered. Society sought a more systematic and holistic set of rules, but how would these rules be determined? Who would write them? And, more importantly, whose interests would they serve? Many historians say that the first written laws began with Hammurabi, but in fact, this process had started centuries before Hammurabi. The written codification of laws was the result of a long social evolution. Hammurabi was merely the king who systematized this process and had it carved onto a single stone stele. But every article carved onto that stele was the accumulation of hundreds of past events, countless tablets, many tiers, and conflicts. And at this point, a question arises in our minds: were the first written laws truly a guarantee of justice, or merely a tool for the powerful to maintain order? The mark of a reed pen pressed into clay contained not only the answer to whom a sheep belonged, but also the question of whose voice would be heard and whose voice would be suppressed. Perhaps law was born out of necessity, but over time it began to transform from a necessity into a power. Scribes became not just recorders but also interpreters, and interpreting is not always an impartial task. Every interpretation brings a decision. Every decision can please one party while disadvantaging another. So, who could truly find justice within this system? The lines, still legible on the corner of a tablet, scattered among the dusty winds of Mesopotamia, might offer a small clue to this question. Justice is equal on the scales of the gods, but when a human holds the scales, the pans sometimes tilt. It is unknown whether this sentence belongs to a priest, a scribe, or is merely a complaint voiced after an injustice suffered. But isn't this precisely what even today's legal systems still debate? And now, as you are left alone with these questions, we can't help but turn back to that world where time flowed much slower and ask, when did true justice really become merely the right of the powerful? As you still listen in silence, we move towards another scene slowly unfolding under the dusty Mesopotamian sun. After those first records born from the earth, something harder, more permanent, and more comprehensive than mud is about to emerge. Because society has become too complex to progress solely by memory, and now a king undertakes the responsibility of not only representing justice, but also defining it. By the 18th century BCE, Hammurabi, the powerful king of Babylon, takes a step to establish order in society. This step will be written not on clay, but on stone, and this stone will not just bear the traces of past events, it will be a proclamation of order. Hammurabi's laws are carved onto a 2.5-meter-high black diorite stele. At its head, Hammurabi is depicted receiving the laws from the god Shamash. This scene is designed not only to demonstrate divine legitimacy, but also to instill in the public the perception that justice has come from the heavens, because a command from the heavens cannot be questioned or changed. However, the language of these laws carved onto the stele is harsh. Each article is short and imperative. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. This is a direct example of the legal concept widely known in history as an eye for an eye. But upon closer inspection, this assumption of equality does not apply to every individual in society. If a noble puts out the eye of a commoner, the penalty is only a monetary payment. But if a commoner puts out the eye of a noble, he loses his own eye. This difference shows that justice was not universal but class-based. So written laws arrived, but this did not mean that everyone gained equal rights. On the contrary, the differences between power and status were now made more systematic. What is striking at this point is that laws are no longer shaped by personal memory or local traditions. The king's word, united with the sacred, is imposed on the entire society, and this imposition no longer merely determines to whom a sheep belongs, but also defines how people should behave towards each other. Sometimes it even implies how they should think. In that era, for a man to be considered guilty, having one witness was enough. 2 witnesses were better. But details such as who the witnesses were, whom they were affiliated with, and from which city they came, silently determined the course of the decision, and most of the populace could not read the written laws, because writing was in the hands of only an educated minority. This meant that even though laws were written for the people, they were written in a language they could not understand. At this point, the scribes once again enter the scene. They are no longer merely record keepers, but also the spokespersons of the laws. It is their duty to read, explain, and interpret the law. But this duty is also a power. The words spoken from a scribe's lips can determine a family's fate, because how he reads, explains, or conceals something shapes the decision accordingly. This, over time, begins to erode society's trust in justice. On the other hand, Hammurabi's laws also contained some social principles, not just punishments. For example, if a farmer's field was damaged by flood, he could receive a tax reduction. Or if a debtor could not pay his debt due to drought, he could be granted an extension. Such provisions were designed to increase the king's legitimacy over the people. Yet, the question of for whom and to what extent these applications were valid always carried an ambiguity. The king not only governed justice but also displayed it. Steles were placed in city squares. Even if they couldn't read what was written on them, the people knew of the existence of these steles. For them, these stones were symbols of the king's power and his connection to the heavens, as if that stone had descended from the stars, as if everything written there was a direct command from the gods. But behind these stones were the silent struggles of daily life. A farmer trying to protect his field, a father wanting to leave his house as an inheritance, a child searching for his stolen sheep. And over time, something was noticed. While written rules brought order to society, they also restricted people's scope of action. Every behavior now had to fit into a framework, and anything that did not conform to that framework was considered a crime. Whereas previously a dispute could be resolved by the word of an elder, now the same dispute required a court, and the court operated in a world known only to writing. With this transformation, law became detached from personal conscience and embedded within the system. People no longer determined right from wrong based on their own feelings, but according to the articles written on tablets. But no one saw the hand that wrote those tablets. because the king was now the representative of an invisible law. And the more abstract the thing represented, the more powerful it was. So, did this situation relieve the people? In a sense, yes, because now everyone knew what constituted a crime, but at the same time, no, because in a system where not everyone, especially ordinary people, had the knowledge or power to defend themselves, written laws could increasingly become an instrument of fear. The kings who followed Hammurabi tried to continue his legacy. Every city, every era encountered new laws, but the essential structure did not change. Power continued to define justice. Writing became a tool of order, and society gradually got used to it because people, above all else, want order, at whatever cost. And so those first records born from the clay transformed into a system living in stone. This journey from the first stroke of a reed pressed onto mud to the cuneiform on black stone perhaps answers not only to whom a sheep belonged, but also whose voice would be heard and whose voice would be suppressed. But still, we cannot help but ask that question. If justice depends solely on writing, what if the hands that hold the writing are wrong? Written laws now stood on stone steles. They rose silently in city squares, casting their shadows upon people every morning as the sun rose. Hammurabi's reign may have ended, but the steles remained. Those steles carried not only the will of a king, but also the spirit of an age, and each stone was a silent but permanent narrator of its time. Over time, this written law spread to other Mesopotamian cities. After Babylon, Assyria, then Urartu, and even more northern communities began to develop their own legal texts. Each created their own versions of justice, shaped according to their understanding. But one thing remained constant. Written law had now become the invisible bedrock of daily life. People began to learn what they could and could not do, not just from societal customs, but from written rules. And this situation, unnoticed, brought about a great change. Previously, the word of a neighbor, an elder, or a priest was enough to resolve a dispute. Now, such words had given way to rules written on tablets. It was no longer the word but the writing that passed judgment, and writing was not always fair. For example, a slave opposing his master was considered a crime regardless of the circumstances. Even if a woman suffered physical violence from her husband, she could not find a forum to voice it in public. Because written rules, while strictly delineating the boundaries of social roles, were shaped in favor of those who defined these rights, rather than questioning the rights of individuals. Children born into this system learned at what age they could marry, at what age they could work, or when they would be considered responsible according to the laws. Fathers knew they could disinherit their children, and mothers knew they could not claim rights outside of household duties. In other words, written law shaped the habits of a society not only through crime and punishment, but by permeating every moment of life. And as time passed, this system became so commonplace that people stopped questioning the existence of writing. Tablets were no longer solely in the hands of priests or scribes. Merchants, farmers, artisans also began to learn to write. While this might seem like a liberation, it also gave rise to a new field of discipline, because those who learned to write were also forced to question what was written. However, the courage to question did not always find a response. In some cities, especially during times of war or famine, people met with harsh reactions when they tried to debate written rules, because written law had become an instrument of legitimacy in the hands of a king or the priestly class. Those rules defined not only order, but also the framework of obedience, and those who did not obey were considered to be pushed not only outside the law, but outside of society itself. Nevertheless, at certain periods, different voices were raised. For example, some tablets found around the city of Lagash record that the people presented petitions against excessive taxation by temples. These petitions were directed not to the king directly, but to the priestly class. This shows that people gradually not only accepted the written legal order, but also learned to use it. Perhaps these objections did not immediately yield results, but they represented a memory, a resistance. Over time, Mesopotamian cities fell, and other civilizations rose. But the idea of written law persisted. Persians, Greeks, Romans, all, while establishing their own systems, somehow continued this understanding of order inherited from Mesopotamia. Even today, some legal principles still valid in many countries around the world are directly based on these cuneiform inscribed stone steles. For example, concepts such as definition of crime, proportionality of punishment, and proof by witness were first carved onto tablets in that era. But this legacy is not merely comprised of legal principles, it also carries a sense of responsibility. To write, to record, to document. All these are not just for establishing order, but for carrying the past into the future. And the past consists not only of the stories of heroes or kings. The true past lies in the small notes that unknown scribes dropped into the corners of tablets. Debt paid, dispute resolved, field boundary measured. While these may seem like ordinary details, they form the backbone of a civilization. And now, thousands of years later, as you read or listen to these lines, you might realize this. The concept of justice is still wrestling with the same questions. Justice for whom? Justice written by whom? What truth is buried in what silence? Written laws might give a person a sense of security. You know what happens if you do something, but they also draw boundaries, they suppress creativity, they diminish courage, and over time they can turn into a system that excludes a person's inner voice, their conscience. What is written, for whom it is written, and who is silenced are also important. In today's modern world, law books have grown thicker, courts have multiplied, legal systems have become layered. But we still continue to ask the same questions. Is justice valid for everyone, or is it more accessible for some and further away for others? Perhaps this is why those first scribes of Mesopotamia always left small, empty spaces at the edge of every line. Perhaps so a new note could be added. Perhaps so one day someone might come along and write something truer. Perhaps those empty spaces were left for each generation to write its own question. And now, as you close your eyes at the end of this story, you can listen to that thought silently wandering in your mind. If a society's understanding of justice relies solely on what is written, what happens to what is unwritten? As you close your eyes at this hour, as the night slowly deepens, we move towards one of the most silent discoveries in history. This discovery is neither as grand as finding a new continent, nor as noisy as winning a war. But it is something that profoundly affected and determined the course of human history, the measurement of time. This story begins with a farmer, his eyes fixed on the sky. Someone who watched the sun rise from the same direction every morning and the stars appear at the same hour every night. For him, the sky was not just a distant landscape, but a clock that determined the rhythm of life, because when to sow, when to harvest, when to irrigate, all depended on the order in the sky, the rising of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the positions of the stars were essential for his survival. And one day, it was thought that this order needed to be followed not just by observation, but by calculation. That day, time was first desired to be put into order. In Mesopotamia, time was initially linked solely to agriculture. When would the waters overflow? In which month would it rain? When would drought arrive? To find the answers to these questions, people looked to the sky, and over time it was noticed that certain stars appeared at certain times, the moon waxed and waned in specific ways, and the sun rose and set at particular points. These cycles began to be recorded. Initially, they were just observations, but then these observations became regular, and eventually something was born, the calendar. The first Mesopotamian calendars were based on the phases of the moon, because the moon was the most visible and variable entity in the sky. New moon, crescent, full moon, each was a natural sign indicating the passage of time. Months were created with these signs. A month was approximately 29 or 30 days. 12 months together formed a year. But there was a problem here. The lunar calendar did not perfectly align with the solar year. While the lunar calendar lasted 354 days, the solar year was approximately 365 days. This difference eventually caused the seasons to shift. Planting time started to coincide with winter and harvest time with spring. This difference began to make Mesopotamian priests ponder. They were responsible not only for religious ceremonies but also for agricultural and social order, and this order depended on the calendar working correctly. If the calendar shifted, festivals would be held at the wrong time, irrigation would be delayed, and harvests would rot. For this reason, a special month called the intercalary month was added. Approximately every 3 years, an extra month was added to the calendar, ensuring that the seasons and the calendar were realigned. This was one of the first steps, showing that time could be controlled, not only by nature but also by human intervention. But over time, this system became even more complex, because now, not just agriculture but also taxes, debts, agreements, and court dates were determined by the calendar. If a debt was to be paid at the next full moon, it was necessary to know exactly when that full moon would be. Similarly, if a court was to be held on the 3rd day of the 5th month, that day had to mean the same thing to everyone. The calendar was no longer indispensable only for farmers, but also for merchants, administrators, and scribes. With this development, time, for the first time, ceased to be merely a concept and became a tool. Time was now something that could be measured, calculated, and planned. And this also meant that time could be controlled. Whoever could measure time also determined the order. At this point, the role of priests once again came to the fore. From observation posts erected on top of temples, stars were watched, moon phases were noted, and the sun's movements in the sky were recorded. At the beginning of each month, priests would announce which days were sacred and which days should not be worked. Some days were considered unlucky, while others were deemed auspicious. Thus, time became not only a physical measurement, but also a spiritual guide. But there was a striking point here. The measurement of time had begun to limit people instead of freeing them, because now everything had a time. When to sow the seed, when to pay the debt, when to go to the temple were all fixed. And this certainty was also a necessity. Time was now a framework. Stepping outside that framework was not just disorder, but could also be considered a crime. For example, in some cities, merchants who were late to the market could have their goods confiscated, and those who did not attend rituals on time could be punished. Some inscriptions even record that marriages performed on a day other than that determined by the priest were considered invalid. In other words, the calendar directed not only time but also behavior, and any behavior that fell outside of time carried the risk of being pushed outside of society. This situation gradually changed people's internal perception of time as well. Previously, time was a flow in harmony with nature. The sun would rise, work would be done, night would fall, and one would rest. But now time was divided into days, hours, moments. And this division made human life more calculated but also more restricted. So how did people react to this situation? Did a questioning begin as this order, which they initially accepted, gradually shaped every aspect of their lives? Or did learning the calendar and planning time give people a kind of security? Perhaps both. For some, the calendar was a helper that brought order to the chaos of life. For others, it was an invisible chain. And how this chain was used depended on who controlled it. In Mesopotamia, time was observed not from the eyes of ordinary people, but from the towers of temples. Thus, those who defined time also shaped society. Just as with written law, the calendar was used to ensure order, not equality, and this order did not always have to be fair. However, for a farmer, time is merely the cycle of seasons. In a mother's eyes, time is the growth of her child. In an elder's mind, time is the slowly fading voices, but for a ruler, time is a calculable resource, a controllable tool. And it is here that we see the bond between time and nature begin to break. Because time is no longer measured from the sky, but from a ruler. While all this was happening, people still did not stop looking at the sky. They still watched the moon turn crescent, the orbit of the stars, because there is a feeling that remains outside every ruler, a time that cannot be contained by the calendar. Perhaps that is why there are always small empty spaces in the corners of the oldest calendar tablets. Perhaps to remind of a forgotten day or a moment that needs to be added. But still, we cannot help but ask, is time more valuable when it is measured or when we feel it? On the edge of a calendar chart, a faded cuneiform note reads, "Barley planting to begin on the third night of the moon. Priests will pray at the first light of dawn." This sentence, despite its simple appearance, encapsulates the order, belief, and obedient life of an era. Because in Mesopotamia, the calendar was no longer just a tool for measuring time. It had become a system, a shadow that governed the behavior of the people. Measuring time might have initially seemed like a triumph over nature. To be able to track the moon's phases, the sun's movements, the stars' passages, these seemed like extraordinary human achievements. But when does an achievement turn into a test? When the recording of time not only plans it, but also becomes an instrument of discipline. That is when time ceases to belong to humans. Temples were at the heart of this transformation. Ritual days determined by the moon's cycle carried not only religious meaning, they also defined the direction of social life. Going to the market was forbidden on days declared days of mourning. Going to work on dates designated as holy days was considered shameful. Even a girl's marriage, a boy's circumcision, a merchant's debt payment date, or a farmer's irrigation turn was planned according to the calendar. Not everyone understood time, but everyone had to live by it. This necessity gradually transformed into voluntary obedience. People learned what to do on which day and found it safe to behave within that framework, because a movement not in the calendar would be incomprehensible within the community. No one could interpret that. The regulative power of calendars eventually affected personal spheres as well. Everything from marriage dates to the calculation of births was tied to numbers. A child born in a certain month, under a certain star, would have their character determined accordingly. Because star calendars had also become widespread during this period, every movement in the sky carried meaning on Earth, and these meanings were a new dimension of calendars, destiny. People now read not only time, but also their own future according to the calendar. Beliefs such as children born this month will be strong, women married under this star will be fertile, had become embedded in the collective consciousness of society. These astrological calendars were also useful for the ruling class. When a war would be launched, when a king would ascend the throne, all were determined according to these celestial signs and their reflection in the calendar. However, all this calculation suppressed the human sense of time that came from within. Perhaps a father wanted to marry his son in spring, but the calendar called it an unlucky day. Perhaps a woman wanted to experience her pregnancy in harmony with nature, but astrological calculations told her to wait impatiently. And each time, individual perception of time was silenced by the collective calendar. Another aspect of this silence was the separation of time that emerged between different social classes. Nobles could bend the calendar. They could use holy days for their own interests. But ordinary people did not have this privilege. For them, every day had to be lived as dictated by the calendar. And this necessity, over time, turned into a habit, and even a submission. While all this was happening, Mesopotamian cities grew, and temples became more complex structures, and calendar systems diversified. In some regions, 12 months were used. In Mesopotamia, calendars were not merely a series of numbers or a sequence of days. They were the map of life. They permeated every step taken, every decision, every wait from birth to death. When a child was born, they wanted to know under which star they were born, because stars were the signs that carried the calendar, and the calendar described not only time but also destiny. Looking back today, we can see that those who invented the calendar, while wanting to establish order, also drew a boundary. This boundary was invisible but very real. People began to live not their own inner time, but societal time. As the things everyone did on the same day multiplied, differences shrank, became silent, and turned inward. The individual became part of a routine. They learned that if they didn't conform to a timeline, they could be excluded, and precisely for this reason, they chose to conform. But when did this conformity turn into a silence? On days when a woman remembered her birthday only by the calendar, when a farmer only looked at the debt calendar, when a child's school start date was calculated only by the academic year, perhaps we started to lose our connection with time. Time became like a divided file for us, not a flowing river. Monday morning, Friday evening, New Year's Eve, tax season, all became identities defined by time for us, but also things that time took from us. Yet in Mesopotamia, once upon a time, time was lived with the sky. When a star appeared, people greeted it. When the moon was new, fields were prepared. Everything was tied to the cycle of nature. But then, people who lowered their gaze from the sky to the tablets filled the place of time with numbers. This was perhaps more precise, more planned, more secure. But that initial emotional connection began to fade. Some personal records found in historical tablets bear the traces of this low. Mesopotamia's first calendar was written on mud. When it dried, it turned to stone. And perhaps that was the most enduring part, but the time that forms in your mind is still fluid. It might be carved not on a tablet, but on a remembered glance, the scent of a season, the silence of a morning. And this time is the unwritten but felt time. As night deepens amidst all these silent thoughts, perhaps you can now see time not just as a ruler, but as a bond established between the sky and humanity, almost forgotten, yet still felt. And now you can be alone with this thought echoing in your mind. If measuring time means controlling life, could feeling time be the first step towards freedom? As you listen to the silence of the night, you can imagine a drop falling. That drop might not be from a roof, but onto the lands of thousands of years ago, the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Life begins where that drop falls. Life in Mesopotamia was written with water, read with water, vanished with water. And this is why one of the greatest legacies left by this civilization is neither writing nor law. The most lasting trace is one silently lying in the bed of a dried-up canal, the trace of water. As you close your eyes now, you might see those lands scorched by the sun. The horizon line is flat. There are no shadows. The wind is dry. But that bareness is deceptive, because right beneath it lies one of the world's first great engineering projects, irrigation canals. structures opened by human hands directed by stone, eventually becoming the skeleton of cities. Thanks to them, the land turned green. And when the land turned green, people decided to settle in one place. But this decision was not easily made. The first communities were nomadic. They went where the water was. When a river overflowed, when a lake dried up, people would pack their belongings and move elsewhere, until someone thought, what if we directed the water? That thought was the true beginning of Mesopotamia, because there was no gold or silver in these lands. But whoever controlled the water controlled life, and this control, over time, became a form of power. The first irrigation canals were not large structures, they were just small ditches. A branch splitting from a river would wind its way between a few fields. But each year, this ditch would extend a little further, widen a little more, and each year, more people would want to use this water. One more field, one more village, one more need. Water had now begun to move not only by nature's will, but also by human decision. At this point, a small but profound problem arose. Water justice. Water would reach the fields at the very beginning of a canal, early and in abundance. But for those approaching the end of the canal, the water would slow down, sometimes not reaching them at all, and this sparked the first conflicts, because everyone put in the same effort, but not everyone received the same water. That's when the first agreements were made. Water would be distributed in turn. Every field would have its right, and no one could take extra. These decisions were put into writing, carved into stones, and perhaps this is how the first common use protocol emerged. But this order concerning water could not be maintained by writing alone, because sometimes a family would open the gates without waiting for their turn, redirecting the water to their own field. Sometimes a village would quietly divert the canal at night, leaving another village without water. These situations led to the birth of a new class, irrigation officials. They physically controlled the canals and socially tried to resolve disputes, a kind of early water guardians. This task was not easy, because water was silent, but it was a cause for conflict. It was possible to punish a village without throwing stones, without drawing swords, simply by turning a water gate. This made water not only vital, but also a strategic tool. Especially in years of drought, the value of water increased even further. Now, even a single drop could determine the fate of a village. And so, water became not only a physical, but also a political element in Mesopotamia. Kings saw the expansion of water canals as a display of power. Every newly opened canal meant new fields, new peoples, and new taxes. Hundreds of kilometers of main waterways were dug through large engineering projects. These pathways were used not only for agriculture, but also to provide drinking water to cities, to water animals, and even for ritual purification in some religious ceremonies. Thousands of workers were employed in the construction of these large structures, people digging the earth with their hands under the sun in dried-up soil. Some were free, some were indebted, some were prisoners of war, but all worked for the same water. This shows how class division intersected with water in Mesopotamia, because some directed the water while others spent their lives trying to access it. Over time, this system developed so much that water distribution schedules were prepared. It was determined which village would receive water on which day and at what time. These schedules were prepared by priests and administrators and distributed to scribes on tablets. But even here, justice could not always be ensured. Some powerful families could seize the water turn of ordinary people, and some villages could be left completely without water during dry periods of the year. This shows that water was both a blessing and a privilege. At this point, an interesting silence emerges. Very few complain. TS about water are found, because people knew the value of water, but they also sensed what it would cost to raise their voice against it. Objection to water was seen not only as a rebellion against administration, but also against nature. For this reason, many disputes were explained by technical reasons, such as water overflows or clogged canals. Even if an injustice had truly occurred, people would not openly write about it. And this silence gradually permeated the culture. Water was not discussed, water was not written about, but everyone revolved around it. Even Mesopotamia's largest temples were built on riverbanks. Rituals, prayers for rain, offerings made to water, all were connected to water. But that connection was always silent, because water, no matter how it flowed, never cried out. That's why a saying by an old man who once sat on the banks of the Tigris watching the river flow still echoes today. Water doesn't speak, but it knows everything. And now, as you get lost in these words, a question may slowly seep into your mind. If a civilization can be built with a drop, what happens when the direction of that drop changes? As you move away from the riverbed, the sound of the earth changes. First it is soft, wet. You sink into it when you step. Then it begins to crack. It hardens. A fine dust rises with the wind. This silent transition is actually the rhythm of life in Mesopotamia. If there is water, there is life. As water recedes, that life first cracks, then forgets. But people did not forget. To prevent water from moving away, they did not only dig canals, they also wove a culture. They established an order where irrigation nourished not only the land, but also society. And this order became so internalized over time that people began to determine not only the direction of the river, but also their own destiny according to that direction.
Farmers would wake up at the first light of dawn. They had to reach the head of the canal before the sun rose, because if they missed their turn, their fields could go without water for days. That's why in every village there would be an old man who knew the water schedule and managed the timing. He would be consulted, his word would be heard. These individuals usually couldn't write, but they knew the sound of the water, the change in its flow, what the earth needed. And their knowledge was more valid than official written records, because that knowledge was acquired with water, by hand, by eye, over years. However, over time these wise men began to be left alone, because the administration began to see water not only as a necessity but also as a means of control. When, how, and to whom water would be given was now determined by the temples. And this order opened the door not only to an agricultural but also to a social hierarchy. Whoever's field was closer, whose family was older, whose name was written in the temple's ledgers, they had easier access to water. This situation became increasingly visible. In some villages, records show that the same family's fields were given early water for several consecutive years. Some families, on the other hand, consistently remained at the end of the queue. This was not just a matter of timing. Land irrigated early was more fertile. It yielded abundant produce. More harvest meant more bargaining power and a greater ability to pay taxes. This, in turn, strengthened that family's ties with the administrators, and so a class structure quietly emerged. Those at the head of the water and those waiting at the end. This difference was not written, but it was felt in every gaze. Every harvest season, every drought season, this difference became a little more pronounced. Over time, this class distinction was also reflected in tea.
Without entering the official queue, they tried to draw water from the river with ditches they dug themselves. These unofficial canals quickly multiplied, and the administrators reacted to this situation. Because control over water was the foundation of authority, and authority was slipping away with the water. Several villages were punished for this reason. Their canals were closed, their ditches filled. The temples declared such actions to be disrespectful to the gods. But the people slowly began to develop resistance to this threat. Because the exhaustion brought by thirst was now heavier than fear. Nevertheless, this resistance continued not with loud voices, but with whispers. People told each other which canal was more hidden,
which path was more efficient. A flow of unwritten but word-of-mouth knowledge emerged. Water, this time, became a carrier of information outside official channels. Just as it was at the very beginning, knowledge learned by hand, by eye, over years, and this knowledge flowed for centuries. Silently, just like water, Mesopotamia's greatest power, was not just an agricultural tool, but a social structure builder. And this structure was woven with invisible walls. Irrigation schedules determined social positions. The direction of canals determined the direction of relationships. No one directly said, "You are beneath me." But water reminded them of this every day anew. And now, as you walk in the dried bed of these ancient canals, perhaps you realize this. The people of that time did not only dig the earth, but also dug their own lives. Each ditch represented a silence, an acceptance, or a waiting. And another question, it seems, rises from those cracked lands. If water is a blessing, what is the cost of being condemned to wait for it? A canal once dug in the mud may today remain only as a faint trace covered with dust. Yet nature did not operate this way. Rain does not follow a calendar. The river overflows without consulting anyone. Drought comes without warning. But people wanted to bring order to this irregularity of nature within themselves, and they did this by controlling water. But controlling water also meant controlling their own behavior. Thus, water became not only an external tool but an internal discipline. In temple archives, traces of this discipline are hidden in small details. For example, some tablets state that prayers must be offered during canal cleaning. This frames the physical relationship with water within a spiritual context. That is, touching water is also a ritual. Certain words must be spoken, certain movements made before water distribution. Otherwise, water could bring misfortune. Such practices gradually transformed into this. Water became not merely a current to be directed, but an entity to be respected. People approached water not only with need, but also with fear, because the absence of water was considered not only a loss of crops, but the wrath of the gods. Even today, a sensitivity to water is still visible in the ancient lands of Mesopotamia. Those who pray for rain, those who wait silently by the river, those who touch the water first with their right hand. These are perhaps the continuation of a habit from thousands of years ago. And this continuity is one of the deepest roots of the culture. But more importantly, this silence awakens another question in us. If a society centered water so much, what happens when the water recedes? Looking at the history of Mesopotamia, we see that great droughts occurred in some periods, and these droughts caused not only a decrease in crops, but also the abandonment of cities. When the water left, people also left, leaving behind silent walls, dried tablets, and empty temples. Perhaps the most striking, but for those who know how to read, it has a voice whispering from thousands of years ago. That voice is the voice of cuneiform. In Mesopotamia, writing was born out of necessity, not to tell stories, write poetry, or express emotions. The first lines were solely for calculations like how much barley was received, from whom, when it will be returned, because as a community grows, remembering is no longer enough. Memory errs, forgetfulness begins, misunderstandings arise, and humans write on the earth to remember. The first scribes took a reed and pressed it onto wet clay, not harshly, gently, but distinctly. Each mark carried a meaning. 3 horizontal notches meant 3 sheep. A vertical notch meant day. This simple coding system, over time, transformed into hundreds of symbols, and each symbol, while representing something, also became a carrier of information that was not meant to be forgotten. However, these writings were not for everyone. Those who knew how to write were a small segment of society, usually priests, palace officials, or their children, because learning to write required not only practical skill but also long training. Each symbol had a shape, an order, a meaning, and errors were not tolerated. A wrongly written letter could lead to a debt being wrongly paid. Therefore, being a scribe demanded both skill and responsibility. A scribe would wake up early in the morning. He would work in small rooms set up in the shadow of the temple or palace. In front of him, a moistened clay tablet in his hand, a sharpened reed. He was silent, because writing was not like speaking. Writing was meaning within silence, and that meaning could only be deciphered by the right hands. The first writings were very simple. Barley received, to be returned in 5 days. Sheep gave birth, to be offered at the new moon. But over time, people wanted to write not only. And this turned writing not just into a tool, but into an authority. People bowed to the written word and did not question what was not written. And thus, writing became the rule-maker of silence. Nevertheless, some tried to break this silence. Some scribes added small notes to the margins of tablets. Sentences like, "It started to rain while this information was being written," or "The people were silent when the king's order arrived." These were not official records, but personal traces, and these traces whispered that writing could be the voice not only of the powerful, but also of the ordinary. These whispers were few, but they existed, and now as you listen to these lines, perhaps you are thinking, if so many people lived about whom we know nothing today, were they forgotten merely because they were not written about? As a scribe laid his hand on the clay, he might not have realized it, but what he was doing was leaving a mark beyond time. That mark was recording not a debt, but an existence. Perhaps it was the oldest, simplest way to say, "I was here." And in Mesopotamia, people clung to writing for precisely this reason, to not be forgotten, so that even if their voices weren't heard, their traces would remain. But still, a question remains to be asked. If writing tells only the story of the powerful, then who truly remained silent? A writing tablet was only a few centimeters thick. The indentations pressed onto it left barely noticeable marks on the stone. But the impact of these marks was powerful enough to change time itself, because in Mesopotamia, writing had transformed not only into knowledge, but also into a means of persuasion. And persuasion, when done silently, leaves the deepest traces. As you close your eyes now, you can hear a priest climbing the stone stairs with heavy steps. In his hand is a tablet. On the tablet is a list of offerings mad. For example, if a man stole his neighbor's sheep, the priest would listen to the event and write the decision on a tablet. That decision would apply not only to that event, but also to similar situations in the future. Thus, writing became not just a record, but law. Within this system, the authority of writing increased, but at the same time its accessibility decreased, because writing was difficult. There were many symbols, each had a different meaning, sound, and usage. And education took years, therefore scribes became a privileged class. They were the ones who stored, disseminated, and managed knowledge. And this knowledge was silently used when making decisions that affected the lives of ordinary people. For example, a widowed woman comes to the temple. She wants to transfer the field inherited from her husband to her son, but she cannot write. A scribe is called. The woman's words are transformed into symbols. The woman does not understand, but she signs. Perhaps the scribe is transferring that field to someone else. The woman learns this years later, but it is already written. And what is written cannot be changed. This event is not just an individual tragedy, but also shows how profound the power of writing can be. Because in Mesopotamia, writing did not just carry information, it carried power, it carried rights. And over time, people became accustomed to obeying writing rather than opposing it. This obedience was reflected in belief systems as well. Offerings left at temples were recorded in writing. Who gave how much, when they gave it, for what purpose? All was known.
and these records were presented as documents showing how pleased the gods were. But in fact, it was a fine web that kept the people's bond with the temple strong, because people knew if an offering was not recorded, it was considered not made. At this point, writing, tierniki, walitong, unseen witness, felt by everyone. It was not visible to the eye, but it guided behavior. And the tying of everything to writing shaped even people's instincts. Now, people tried to do not just what was right, but what was writable. And this difference, over time, gave rise to a greater silence. Because writing does not write everything. The scribe decides, the priest guides, the king approves, and thus the people begin to live many things that happen in their own lives, not in their own language, but with someone else's pen. Some people were aware of this, and they developed small methods to counter it. Some called a witness before paying a debt. Some tried to have what was written read aloud. Others developed their own signs. They drew small symbols on walls. They arranged stones on doorsteps. These marks had no official counterpart, but those who made them knew these were their own words. This silent resistance was not against writing, but against those who held the monopoly over writing, because when writing ceased to be a tool and became a weapon, people sought new ways. While all this was happening, hundreds of thousands of tablets began to accumulate in the cities of Mesopotamia. These were not just documents, but carriers of order. Tablet rooms were established in the city temples, lines arranged in rows, dated, stamped. Among them were written destinies, recorded steps, forgotten lives. But perhaps the most interesting thing is this. Most of those tablets remained there, unread. Because being written was already enough, writing was no longer about speaking, but about showing existence. And now, as you wander within this wisdom, perhaps you are asking, if everything is put into writing, where do words go? In Mesopotamia, writing was powerful, but it was silent. It narrated what it saw and silenced what it didn't see. And the biggest effect of this, silencing, was the people's gradual loss of their own words. But still, some were looking for a way to write their own words.
Perhaps it was a potter's son, perhaps a slave's wife, perhaps a child's dream. They could not be written, but they lived. And now, this silence behind the writing seems to whisper, in a place where writing is powerful, how do those without a voice live? To walk in a room where clay tablets are stacked means to step on thousands of tiny scratches, on silent sentences written centuries ago with every step. Those sentences now seem to belong to no one. They have no owners. No one remembers them. But they are still there, like stones, whispering to themselves, silently but stubbornly. And within this silence you are left with a question. Why does writing remain? In Mesopotamia, the answer to this question was given very early. Writing remains because humans do not want to be forgotten. Writing remains because humans cannot accept that they lived without leaving a trace. And that is why hands touched the clay, the reed tip was pressed, lines were patiently arranged. Each was the equivalent of a voice, a moment, a desire. Perhaps it was as simple as 2 sacks of barley. But that sentence was someone's labor, and that labor should not be forgotten. That is why in Mesopotamia, writing was used not just to govern, document, forbid, but also to exist. Yet, over time it was realized that writing does not record everything. It does not carry every voice, every tear, every silence. Because writing only preserves the chosen ones, and the unchosen, like an unspoken sentence, slowly evaporate. Those who felt this most were the ones whose names were not written. Potters, carriers, water-carrying children, women ploughing fields. Their names did not appear on tablets. Only the goods they produced, the work they did, the debts they paid were visible. But they too lived, and their lives too were meaningful. But writing did not turn to them, it merely passed over them. Never.
The less these people recorded their existence in other ways. Some carved a small symbol into the corner of a wall, some named their children after their ancestors, and some simply continued their daily work in silence. Because sometimes to exist was merely to continue, and no matter how powerful writing was, it could not erase the trace of those who continued. Most of the Mesopotamian tablets found in modern archives today are debt records, court decisions, and religious texts. But some among them are different. A scribe's practice tablet, full of cuneiform marks he hadn't yet mastered. A line beginning, "My mother is ill," then left unfinished, a bird figure drawn next to a child's name. These are the silent face behind the official face of writing, and perhaps that is the most real one, because those writings were not written to serve something but to evoke a feeling, and feeling often precedes the word. Today we write on phone screens, thousands of words are sent, deleted, forgotten in seconds, but perhaps we still write with the same desire, not to be forgotten. When sending a message, taking a note, or dropping a line in a diary, there is a hidden wish in every word. May one day someone read this and understand. This wish has never changed from Mesopotamia to today. Only the medium has changed from mud to glass, from reed to keyboard. But the silent power of writing is still with us. It still chooses, it still excludes, it still guides. While the most shared posts on social media are visible, the deepest thoughts remain silently in a notebook. And this selectivity shapes us, sometimes without us even realizing it. Today, something being written still gives it power. An unwritten word is forgotten. An unwritten memory is lost. And while we try to record everything, perhaps we forget what matters most, the emotions that writing cannot carry. In Mesopotamia, this contradiction was experienced very early. Writing represented power, but not silence. That's why silence was hidden in the margins, between and in the empty spaces of tablets. A scribe's fingerprint remained on the edge of dried clay. A child's handwriting nestled next to his mother's name. A farmer's wife, a person whose name was never mentioned but who brought water every day, put her own mark on a pot in a corner. And these too became part of the writing, but silent parts. And now, as you stand within all this past, perhaps you realize this. Writing does not tell everything, but what it does not tell is at least as important as what it does tell. Because the true story of history is often hidden between the lines, in the crack of a clay tablet, behind a missing word, in the empty space left by an unwritten sentence. Today we continue to live with those empty spaces. Information is written, documents are organized, records are kept. But people's inner voice often remains silent. And we are still searching. How can we hear this silence? Perhaps the answer is to look again, not just at what is written, but also at what is not written. And perhaps in the end this thought settles in your mind. If a word wants to live forever, it must first learn to hear silence. As you close your eyes, you see a great city, stone streets, temples rising by the river, houses plastered with mud. Each is orderly, each is measured. From the outside, this city seems like a place built by men, because their names appear in inscriptions, their decisions are written on tablets. Wars begin with their names, treaties end with their seals. But behind closed doors, there is another order, quieter, more invisible, more enduring. The name of this order is woman. In Mesopotamia, women's names were not often written. When they were, it was usually as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's daughter, defined by connection, not as an individual. But their existence was more than just names. They were the foundation of a home. Without that foundation, neither the home nor that society could stand. The day began before dawn. The woman was the first to wake. With her hands, she would spread ash under the tandoor, touch the sack of flour, check the dough that had been fermenting overnight. Bringing water was her job, lighting the fire, waking the children, rolling out the dough. None of these would be written on the edge of a tablet, but they were done anew every morning. And this repetition, over time, transformed into knowledge. A silent wisdom passed down from generation to generation. This wisdom was not official, but it was profound. Women, over time, became part of not only the home but also production. They excelled in weaving. In some cities, most fabric markets were in the hands of women. Simple looms in their hands, long threads on their laps, each meticulously crafted, because patience is their silent language. Some women worked in pottery making, some brewed beer. Beer was considered a sacred drink in Mesopotamia, and the masters of this craft were often women. Some names on beer tablets belonged to women, but these exceptions were like small lights shining in a vast silence. Generally, women were only defined within the home. There was no outside for them. They remained in the shadows even in the fields, markets, or temples. But strangely, those in the shadows carried the most burden, because they were the ones who raised children, cared for the elderly, prepared food, applied balm to the sick. These tasks were invisible, but their absence was immediately felt. When a woman fell ill, the rhythm of the home was disrupted, meals were delayed, children cried, water ran low. This shows that a woman was not just a doer, but also a balancing force. When she silently withdrew, order faltered. Even the architecture of homes was shaped according to women. Courtyard houses allowed for both privacy and production. The courtyard was also a small workshop. There, yarn was spun, vegetables were dried, and while children played, women kneaded dough and told stories. The stories were not written, but they were listened to, and sometimes these stories shaped a child's dream. Some women were experts in healing. Knowledge of plants was passed from mother to daughter. Which leaf reduces fever, which herb eases childbirth. None of this was on tablets, but this knowledge saved lives during a society's most difficult times, because what is official is not always what is most necessary. And yet these women were known not by their own names, but by the lives of others. A woman who cut her hair when her son didn't return from the army. A wife who smeared her face with mud when her husband died. Or an older sister who raised her brother's children without ever marrying. Their stories were not told, but everyone knew them, because society's memory was preserved not only in writing, but also in witness. A child would remember his mother's hands. A neighbor would describe the smell of a woman's cooking. These were unwritten but living records, silent but unshakable documents. Over time, some women managed to make their voices heard from within this silence. There were priestesses serving in temples. Some were interested in astronomy, some copied prayer texts. These were exceptions, but even an exception, when outside the system, makes that system question itself. However, most women did not have such opportunities. They were masters of daily rituals. They built a home within silence, and held that home together with emotion. Because a home was not just four walls. The walls of a home were completed with the smell of food, the sound of children, the sound of water, and a moat, this patient gaze. That is why, when a house collapsed in Mesopotamia, not only stones fell. When a woman fell silent, not only words, but also a way of life was lost. And now, as you walk through the back streets of this ancient society, you might notice that silent labor behind thick walls, behind every stone, every door, every shadow, a pair of hands worked. And the trace left by those hands was never written on any tablet. But it is still there. Because some things are not written, they are lived. And as long as they are lived, they are not forgotten. But what about us now? How much do we truly notice the silent burden carried by those women whose names we don't even know today? In Mesopotamia, mourning always began with a woman's first step. The sound of this step was not heard because it was taken not on stone streets but on the earthen floor of the courtyard. But that silent step started the day of a home and indirectly the order of a society. And this order was not given a name because women lived without the names of their work, housework, production, childcare, support for the elderly, weaving, brewing, cleaning, preparing, carrying, gathering, storing. These actions were not put into writing because the cuneiform of that era was used only for major decisions and loud commands, but behind every loud sound there was a whisper, and the owner of that whisper was often a woman. Women were at the heart of Mesopotamian society, but they were invisible on the map. Their boundaries were drawn by walls. They could only go to temples on specific days with specific rules. They could sell goods in marketplaces but had no say. They could borrow money, but a male guarantor was required. Their names were written on marriage tablets, but decisions were often made on their behalf. Husbands, fathers, elder brothers, and this system had become so ingrained that many women never even thought of stepping outside it, because silence was not just a necessity, but also a habit. This habit, passed down from generation to generation, functioned like an invisible education system. Girls grew up watching their mothers, learning when not to speak, when to bow their heads, when to be patient. But this silence was not always a weakness. Within the silence lay deep understanding, planning, and even resistance. For example, some mothers raised their sons differently. They educated their daughters, striving for them to marry someone who could read. Some women formed networks of solidarity among themselves, neighbors helping each other during water-carrying hours, women gathering during childbirth, aunts recommending medicine when a baby fell ill. These were not official, but they were real. And this unofficial system was as effective as the official order established by men. Women also carried knowledge, but this knowledge was not written. A recipe for a meal, the reason for a baby's crying, which stone eased childbirth, which prayers were more readily accepted, none of these were written in cuneiform, but all were known by heart and transferred at the right moment to the right person. The rhythm of this transfer was the language of eye contact, silent agreements, gestures, not words. Nevertheless, some women tried to access writing. The small number of priestesses working in temples began to gain knowledge in this field by copying prayer tablets or observing lunar calendars. It also happened that daughters of wealthy families were taught to read and write. But this situation still remained an exception, because in society, women were allowed to carry knowledge, but not to direct it. It was always others who directed. A widow could not go to court to claim her children's inheritance. Our relative had to be found to speak on her behalf. If there was none, she had to remain silent. Sometimes it was enough for her to press her own finger onto a written document, even if she didn't know its content, because writing was sacred, unquestioned. And so women, even if knowledgeable, had to remain ignorant. Even if they had the right to speak, they could not. This defined the boundary of silence, not just not speaking, but knowing that you cannot speak, or that you won't be heard, even if you do, and living with that knowledge. But this silence, over time, turned into something else: observation. Women were silent but observant. Who came when, who hid what, who forgot what. They knew these things best. With this ability to observe, they became the carriers of social memory. Men went to wars, rulers changed, but women remained, at home, in the field, by the tandoor. They were the ones holding the thread between the past and the future. The wool a woman wove did not just protect from the cold. That wool was the carrier of a silence passed down from generation to generation. A handkerchief a mother gave to her son was not just a piece of cloth. The prayer placed inside that handkerchief was beyond all words. That is why some silences were the most powerful words. Society had sensed this silent power. That is why it tried to control women indirectly, not directly. It limited them not only with walls, but with traditions, roles, expectations. But even within these boundaries, women managed to maintain the balance of life. Because sometimes the inside of a home is wider than the outside world. A woman raising 4 children in her courtyard was actually laying the foundation for 4 different worlds. When her husband went on campaign, she maintained the balance of the home, took care of her elderly mother-in-law, and made decisions when the time came for the harvest in the field. Even if that decision was not written, it was effective, and that effect was sometimes more powerful than what was written. So even though women were shown as being outside the system, they were actually at its center. Today, when we look at Mesopotamian tablets, women's names appear infrequently. But this does not mean they did not exist. It only means they were not written. And perhaps this is the most striking thing, the fact that the unwritten also lived. At night, after the children were asleep, a woman would look at the sky. If the moon was full, she would say, the dough would rise better the next day. If the wind blew from the north, it would be good to do laundry in the morning. These were her calendar, her meteorology, and this knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, silently. No one called them wise, but they knew. No one called them rulers, but they guided. No one called them writers, but they wrote life. With the trace of their hands, with the language of patience, with the rhythm of daily repetition. And now you, in the midst of this long story, perhaps silently wonder, if so much could be done silently, who was truly silent? And then time moved on. Temples crumbled, kingdoms changed, cuneiform gave way to other alphabets. But the morning footsteps on those stone streets remained the same. A woman, to begin the day's first task, stepped silently in the same way. She boiled the milk. She kneaded the dough. She kept the house warm. She protected the children. Even if the walls of the house changed, this cycle did not. Within the mud walls of Mesopotamia, women's voices may not have entered history books. They did not found kingdoms, start wars, or speak directly with gods. But they changed the world without doing any of these things. Because what we call home is not just 4 walls, but the core of a culture. What food is cooked there, how one person addresses another, with what word a child is hushed, what prayer is whispered at the moment of bye.
Then all of these are the essence of a society, and the one who carries this essence is often a woman. Perhaps you are thinking now, did these women never rebel? Did they never say, "Why am I invisible?" Perhaps they did. But they asked this question not with a loud voice, but with action, by patiently waiting by the tandoor, by watching others turn at the water source, by calmly correcting their son's mistake, by telling their daughter, "Don't just be silent, don't forget either," by making their own invisibility a shield for someone else's visibility. And sometimes even this was a rebellion, a silent resistance, a form of existence that history books did not record but life itself remembered. Women's names were rarely carved on tablets, but the pottery they crafted with their hands is still found under the earth. The shape, size, craftsmanship of those pots. Each is like a signature, because sometimes you cannot write your name, but you leave your mark. And the women of Mesopotamia did exactly that. Today, when archaeologists find a small figurine in a house excavation site, they debate whether it belonged to a goddess or an ordinary mother. Perhaps that figurine was just a toy played with by a child, perhaps a stone held by a woman while praying, or just an ornament affixed to the wall of the house, but in any case, it carries a piece of women's daily life. It whispers their world to us silently. And this whisper is sometimes more powerful than a loud speech. What has been told so far are small stories outside of grand narratives. But these small stories are the foundation of grand narratives. In the advanced civilization of Mesopotamia, those who bore the greatest burden of this advancement were usually the nameless. Women, while carrying this burden on their shoulders, also shaped the direction of future generations. And perhaps the most interesting thing is this. Even today, in many societies, women live in a similar silence. Their names are not in the foreground, but their presence is like the cement of a structure, invisible but indispensable. Nothing stands without it. The question to be asked at this point might be, if history is always the story of the loud ones, when will the silent ones be told? And if we today can trace the legacy of Mesopotamian women without even knowing their names, perhaps it is now time to give them a voice, to tell their small steps, their small vessels, their small prayers in grand sentences. Because every civilization exists not with the loudest voices, but with those who carry the most burden. In the hustle and bustle of today, sometimes we can still hear that silent step a woman takes at dawn, that step that begins before everything else begins. And perhaps the oldest history is that very step. This step may not have been heard, but it never stopped. Before the sun has fully risen, in a small city in eastern Mesopotamia, perhaps Larsa, perhaps Sippar, the first footsteps begin to echo on the stone path leading to the marketplace. The air is cool, but soon the sun will drown everything in a yellow blanket. Only the vendors are awake at that hour, because securing a good spot can double the day's earnings. But this morning, as you watch the stir along that narrow path, a mix of mud and stone, you won't just witness the exchange of goods. In this story, something deeper will unfold, the birth of an invisible system. The most fundamental signals of what we today call economy were laid in these markets. Money might not have been invented yet, but value was embedded in every line of bargaining: barley for bread, oil for linen, sesame seeds for leather. Behind all these exchanges there was an invisible but understood system of balance. No, one had written down this balance, but everyone felt it. An old woman bringing a basket of dates would wash them with water at the first light of dawn to show how fresh they were. The young man just ahead had covered his fish with wet herbs to prevent them from spoiling in the heat. No one had taught them these details, but competition, even then, was shaping a language. Buyers would assess prices by looking into the seller's eyes. Standard measures hadn't fully settled yet. A cup of barley meant a different volume in another region, but still, transactions proceeded.
because shopping was not just about measure, but about trust. If a seller had earned a reputation for honesty, his scales wouldn't be disputed, and this trust itself was the oldest building block of what we call today's economy. In that era, markets were places where not only goods, but also information circulated. A disease breaking out in one village would be known in another city. News of a new king ascending the throne would first spread among the spice merchants. Along with trade, news, gossip, and sometimes even beliefs circulated, and this circulation of information turned marketplaces into not just economic but also social and cultural hubs. These areas established an order outside the official structure. While kings issued decrees in their palaces, entirely different rules operated in the markets. When an administrator tried to limit the price of a product, sellers would quietly stop bringing that product to the market. This passive resistance was a sign of the system's self-balancing power. That is why, in Mesopotamia, administrators preferred to implement economic regulations indirectly rather than by direct command. For example, during periods when certain products were abundant, temples would buy large quantities of those products, withdrawing them from the market. The aim was to protect the price, and thus, even the first traces of what we call today's central bank intervention were formed. Temples also provided credit, kept debt records, and took collateral. A farmer could get barley for the current year by offering next year's produce as collateral. If the harvest was bad, he couldn't pay his debt. In this case, he could lose his land and sometimes even his freedom. Thus, economic relations were slowly beginning to determine the sharpest layers of the social structure. At this point, even a simple transaction in a marketplace turned into a decision shaping not only the needs of that day, but also the order of the future. Who could lend to whom? Who would offer which goods for which? When was a trade considered honest, and when was it considered fraud? All these questions were answered not in writing, but through behavior, and behavior was becoming culture. In the marketplace, the order that began in the early morning would become evident by noon and disperse towards evening. But within this temporary order, permanent codes were forming, silent rules accepted by everyone. For example, if a product was still unsold at the end of the day, it indicated that it would be sold at a lower value the next day. This was an unwritten market behavior, and over time it became cultural. Over time, price differences between marketplaces in different cities began to be discussed. A product being cheap in Nippur and expensive in Uruk spurred merchants into action. Transportation, logistics, and caravan routes emerged from these differences. A surplus product in one place was a need in another. And ensuring this balance was the essence of trade. Another thing we encountered in this process was bargaining. Bargaining determined not only the price but also the relationship. How stubborn you were, how flexible you acted, what kind of buyer or seller you were, all of these emerged in this small verbal struggle, and over time this also turned into a matter of character. Being a good bargainer was almost considered a virtue. As you listen to all these silent developments, you might think, how does this chaotic place called a market create such orderly rules within itself? Perhaps that was the shocking truth of Mesopotamian marketplaces. These seemingly unmanaged areas actually operated with an internal balance, establishing their own economy, and this internal order reflected the fundamental logic of modern economies, even thousands of years later. But how did that balance form? If not everyone trusted each other, why did it work so smoothly, and what happened when this system eventually broke down? As the midday sun heated the stone ground, the marketplace had reached its busiest point of the day. Voices rose, people tried to speed up their shopping by creating shade with cloths. But amidst this crowd, some things were remarkably silent. Although there was a hubbub of sound and movement, those who determined the essential functioning of the market remained outside this visible hustle. Temple officials, in their official attire, watched the shopping public, noted prices, and waited to intervene at certain times. Because the temple was not just a place of prayer, it was also the largest economic actor in the region. It stored goods, lent money, charged interest, and even indirectly set market prices. For instance, when barley was abundant in a certain year and prices began to fall, the temple would purchase large quantities of barley to prevent a further price collapse. Similarly, when a product became scarce, it would gradually release stored goods, thereby preventing panic selling and price speculation. All these actions were unwritten strategies but observed by everyone. But the control of the market was not limited to the temple alone. Private merchants also began to increase. Merchants who had been trained in cities like or Mari, skilled in calculations, were now trading not only in their own cities but also with distant regions, knowing languages, being familiar with local measurement systems, knowing which product was valuable in which city. All of these were the invisible capital that merchants possessed. These merchants were often in cooperation with the temple. Awning cloths are gathered, baskets are closed, a few remaining customers make a last effort to bargain. But at that hour, the heart of the market beats slower, deeper, because at the end of the day, the invisible calculations of what happened there begin to be made. The marketplaces of Mesopotamia were not just areas where trade took place. They were also the signal centers of social balance. And the temple would guarantee their credits, and in some cases even cover travel expenses. In return, the merchant was obliged to offer a certain amount of goods to the temple at a fixed price. This relationship was one of the silent engines of the market system. No king would directly interfere with this operation, because if he did, the system would break down. However, there was another invisible layer of the market, the debtors. Farmers often borrowed money before the season started, paying for seeds, labor, or irrigation canals. If the harvest was good, there was no problem. But if it was bad, that's when the land of the farmer who couldn't pay his debt was confiscated. Worse, he and his family could fall into slavery to cover the debt. This situation created a serious class division in Mesopotamian society. In the marketplace, this difference was felt silently. Some people's products were on the ground, not on a stall. Some didn't even have a weighing scale, and some just looked but didn't buy. Economic inequality was like a voiceless language. Everyone understood it, but no one spoke out loud. Over time, during certain periods, this inequality began to cross invisible boundaries. Public reaction against temple control and merchants' greed grew slowly but effectively. But this reaction was not like a modern rebellion. Protests in Mesopotamia were also silent. At one point, certain products suddenly became unavailable in some markets. For example, soapwort seeds or honey. A certain segment of the population stopped selling these products. No one explained why, but everyone knew this was a warning. Prices were not fair. The number of debtors had increased. Sellers were no longer just buying and selling, they were also sending messages with their behavior. Administrators had to watch these silent reactions, because if the market broke down, the city would collapse. Economic balance was maintained not by walls or soldiers, but by trust, habit, and culture. Another silent structure in the market was the units of measurement. Initially, each city used its own system of measurement. The SE unit in Uruk, a different cup volume in Nippur, but as trade increased, this confusion began to cause losses. Consequently, standard measures gradually began to be established. These units of measurement were carved into the walls of temples and hung at the entrances of marketplaces. Thus everyone came to know how much was what. But the standardization of measurement was also a display of power, because whoever determined the measure also influenced the price, and the question of who held this power over time turned into intercity rivalry. As some marketplaces grew, they began to swallow the economies of the surrounding villages. Small producers, unable to compete in large city markets, were forced to give their goods to intermediary merchants. This also gave rise to a new class, the producer, who couldn't find a place in the market. All this structure indicated that the Mesopotamian economy was built upon an unwritten, yet highly effective, shadow order. Marketplaces were not just places for goods, but silent theatres where people's fates were also determined. Every move brought a consequence. Every silence carried a message. As you look at this market order from a distance, you can't help but ask yourself a question. This system, so complex, running with such delicate balances, when did it break down? What happened that some cities collapsed and others rose? To find the answer, we now move to the final section. How long did these natural but fragile codes of the economy last throughout history, and why couldn't some survive? As the sun sets, the market slowly empties. Signal was a harbinger of what was to come. Over time, this order began to push against its own limits. Debt relationships, in particular, formed the weakest link in the economic structure. When there was an abundance of produce, prices fell, and farmers earned less, but their debts remained constant, and the interest on those debts did not change. In years of bad harvests, thousands of villagers could suddenly find themselves indebted, landless, and hopeless. While temples and wealthy merchants benefited from this cycle, the lower strata of society experienced a deep economic rupture. This was an unseen but sharp divide. City centres grew richer, while surrounding villages grew poorer. The powerful in the centre built larger granaries, higher walls. This gave rise to an order dominated by fear, not trust. Some cities tried to balance this rupture. Periods were declared when debts were alleviated or erased. Rulers like Hammurabi enacted laws protecting the rights of debtors. For example, a debtor's son could not be enslaved due to debt. However, these laws only delayed the collapse rather than completely healing the structure. Because the problem was not just economic but structural, the economy was no longer directly tied to land and labor. It was tied to papers, contracts, and debt notes. And debt, over time, had become a power that determined not only people's possessions, but also their decisions, their freedoms, and even their futures. This situation silently brought down some of Mesopotamia's cities. Religious and commercial centers like Nippur were dependent on products from surrounding villages. But as villagers fell deeper into debt, production decreased. Decreased production raised prices. Rising prices multiplied the number of debtors. This vicious cycle led to cities being unable to sustain themselves with their own resources. Trade routes also began to lose their security. Road taxes increased, and as caravans decreased, product variety diminished. This directly affected the market. Because Mesopotamia's market economy relied on these fragile connections with the outside world, some cities, such as Mari, were able to adapt to this change. With a small but flexible market structure, they survived by supporting local producers. They established small-scale trade networks with local currencies. The authority of merchants to lend was limited. Single-price applications began for some products. In such places, the market was not just an area for exchange, it was also preserved as a common memory. But most cities could not be so flexible. And eventually, the dissolution of the market meant the dissolution of society, because those markets were at the center of a large network where thousands of people were invisibly connected to each other. And when that network broke, trust between people also disappeared. So what does all this tell us today? Perhaps the most important lesson to be learned from the markets of Mesopotamia is this: Economy is not just about money, goods and prices. It is also a form of relationship. It is the concrete manifestation of people's trust in each other, responsibility, and silent agreements. And when that relationship breaks down, no matter how large the warehouse is, how many laws, how many goods there are, the foundation of a society is shaken. Now, as you close your eyes, recall the stone ground of that marketplace. An old farmer sitting on the side silently watching the prices, a woman calculating money to buy dates for her child, a merchant carefully zeroing his scale, because true history was hidden in the small, silent choices of those people. But you can't help but wonder, can you? Amidst all this economic complexity, how did an ordinary person manage to continue their daily life? How did a child growing up in the shadow of a market see their future? And how did people protect themselves without getting lost in those invisible classes? To find the answer, we move to the next chapter. There I will take you to the very center of this system, to the daily life of a simple person, perhaps to history's most forgotten, yet most felt layer. Chapter 7. Priests and observers, guardians or gatekeepers of knowledge. In the most silent moment of the night, a lamp still burned in a temple in the center of Babylon. The flame, flickering with the wind, cast shadows on the stone walls. The shadows seemed to try to tell something with an alphabet of their own. You were there, silently observing. You were just watching, saying nothing. The priest sitting by that lamp was reading a tablet, but not aloud in his mind, because this knowledge was not meant to be heard with the ear, but to be carried in the heart. This was Mesopotamia's most powerful silent class, the priests. They ostens, Sibyl prayed, built altars to the gods, observed the stars, but in their invisible aspect they did something else. They controlled knowledge, and this control was greater than that of kings. Because a king could lose his throne, but a priest, as long as he did not lose knowledge, could remain behind every throne. In Sumer, in Babylon, in Akkad, every great city had a temple, and in every temple a room. The things stored in that room were not stones, not money, not seeds. They were knowledge. Calculations of moon cycles, annual records of river floods, tables on which product would be abundant if which god was prayed to on which day. This information was not just about the earth or the gods, but about people, how people thought, how they feared, how they hoped. The priests knew this, and that is why they did not open knowledge to everyone. Only they knew the time a star would rise. Only they could read what a lunar eclipse signified. And if a king went to war at the wrong time, if a people prayed to the wrong god, only the priests could foresee the outcome. The name of this power was secret knowledge. But you are thinking now, aren't you? Why was this knowledge kept secret? Why was it not shared with everyone? Because knowledge, if shared, brings responsibility. And perhaps at that time, people were not ready for it. Or perhaps the priests wanted them to think so. In any case, knowledge was power. And as long as that power remained in certain hands, society remained balanced. Or so it was only believed. One day, a student priest opened a tablet. On that tablet, there was a record describing river floods. But this record also stated that a village had been completely wiped out. Neither the name of the village nor its people were remembered. It just said 327 people migrated due to flood. At that moment, the young priest asked, is knowledge just numbers? And that question remained unanswered, because priests might have known everything, but they did not tell everything. They were a mirror.
But they decided when and to whom the mirror would be held. You are inside that temple again now. You pass through dark stone corridors, figures carved into the walls look at you. Some are goddesses, some are priests, and some are just eyes. They are just looking at you. And perhaps Mesopotamia's true wisdom lay here, to observe, to watch above all else, to pause, to wait before trying to understand immediately, because sometimes more valuable than an answer was the question itself. So what remains today from the wisdom of this ancient society? The star charts carved on tablets, the debt records extracted from temple archives, or the shadows of priests who knew everything but told little? Perhaps all of them. But most importantly, it might be this. Mesopotamia's advancement was not just a technological or administrative achievement, it was a way of thinking. It began with observation, continued with recording, and was preserved by selective forgetting. And now you, thousands of years later, remember that ancient society's respect for knowledge and its caution in sharing knowledge. This was an era when not all knowledge was disclosed, not all secrets were revealed. History books tell of kings. But in Mesopotamia, those who carried knowledge were the unspoken ones, not the unwritten ones, but the unspoken ones, because true knowledge perhaps lived most deeply in silence. And that is why Mesopotamia's advancement was not just in its cities, its cuneiform, its astronomy, but in its way of preserving knowledge. Sometimes hidden under a stone, sometimes behind a tablet, sometimes in the depths of a gaze, and perhaps it is still there. But the real question is, now that you have seen that knowledge, what will you do? तुमको टेक्स्ट फाइल की स्क्रिप्ट दे रही, एक से उसके हिसाब से 40 high quality image देना. Each image must be complementing the script according to sense and the art. Style must be historical, digital painting, cinematic lighting, warm, golden plough, cold blue contrast, realism, atmospheric, 8K, intricate details must be added with every single prompt.